And let's give Doug Bond a second to get to his seat. Otherwise, I'll get started in a minute. All right, let me just say, oh, great. Thanks, Doug. I know some of you quite well. Thank you for taking time. I've learned a ton today. It's been a long day. In some ways, it's appropriate that we hear about reentry last today, but I really don't want to feel like it's giving short shrift at all, because in my experience doing this work, in some ways, the hardest work in the whole criminal legal system is the job that you all do, ensuring people can safely reenter community, especially in a place like California, which gives traditionally so few resources to people leaving prison. So our last panel is about reentry from incarceration back to the community in California. In particular, we've asked panelists to discuss what are sometimes called halfway houses, as we've been discussing, or community reentry centers, places where still technically in custody, but have much more freedom to move about in the community and begin transition back to home. And the question is whether or not California can make greater use of these facilities. As with all of our panelists, I'm asking you to please keep opening remarks to 5 minutes or less, and so we can have a conversation with the committee, which is usually the most productive time. So we have 3 panelists for this last group, and I'll ask you to speak in this order. The first is Susan Burton, who is a legend in this business. She's the founder and president of A New Way of Life in Los Angeles. Doug Bond, who's the chief executive officer of Amity Foundation, and Matt Cate, who is the president of Cate Consulting. He is the former secretary of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and also former executive director of the California State Association of Counties, or CSAC. So I've spoken to you all about this issue. I know that you have a lot to say, so thanks for your time. Ms. Burton, we'll begin with you.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Romano, for this work that you're doing, all the work that you've been doing. So my name is Susan Burton. I'm the founder and president of A New Way of Life Reentry Project. At A New Way of Life, we provide holistic reentry services for women who are exiting prisons and jails. Those comprehensive services are housing, family reunification, leadership development, legal support, advocacy, organizing, and job services. These services ensure that people, women leaving incarceration, have an opportunity for success. They work with us to restore the rights of formerly incarcerated people and advocates for change and on their own personal transformation. Everything we do is driven by our mission to provide space for formerly incarcerated women to heal and to become leaders in their communities. I started A New Way of Life following my own incarceration. I was caught in the prison system for almost 2 decades. I had a substance use challenge. I was incarcerated 6 different times for possession of a controlled substance. And never once while being incarcerated did I get the support I needed to successfully return to the community. No one recognized that I had a grief and a trauma problem and not a criminal problem. My grief and trauma was triggered by the accidental killing of my 5-year-old son, which sent me into a spiral of depression and grief. Without the support, I turned to drugs and was incarcerated. While I was incarcerated, Mr. Romano, I prayed really hard to go to this halfway house. And I was never selected, even though I had a classification score that would allow for my placement in a halfway house. After several prison terms, I figured if I could just get a start after I left prison, perhaps I just wouldn't return. But I was never, ever selected. Seems like my prayers went unanswered. But ironically, in 2018, I received a call from the board president of Harbor Area Halfway Houses. And he asked me if I would take over Harbor Area Halfway Houses and allow it to merge with the New Way of Life and it become a project of a New Way of Life. So we did. But after taking over Harbor Area Halfway Houses, which was fully funded by the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, with it being a part of a New Way of Life, it did not match up with our model. We support women to dream. We support them to go after their life's goals. We support them to create new goals. And that is not what the Harbor Area Halfway House did. Under the contract, it was just oppressive. We had to continually UA people. There was no trust built. There was no autonomy. There was no motivation. They were just kind of housed there. So we terminated the contract and implemented a New Way of Life's model, and has since just experienced great success. What I want to leave with the committee is that we have trained over, we have housed over 1,200 women with a 95% success rate. We have trained over 70 people nationally to replicate our model. We now have our model in 18 states and 2 countries. What we know is when people have the right success, the right supports, that they're successful. What we know is that community supports makes our community safer, saner, and allows our community to thrive, for all people to thrive. So I'm going to say that we have a philosophy here that everyone have value, and given support, everyone will succeed. So I'm going to end there and allow the next person. My 5 probably went over my 5, Mr. Romano.
Just a few seconds, and I'm sure we have plenty of questions for you. So thank you for joining us. Mr. Bond?
Thank you. And thank you to the committee for inviting me here today. Doug Bond, President and CEO, Amity Foundation. Susan, wonderful to see you as always and hear all the amazing work you're doing.
Good to see you too.
Amity Foundation is currently working in 18 prisons, 8 county jails. We provide services residential settings throughout the LA County area in the continuum of care in San Diego as well. We serve about 20,000 people a year. Now, Amity Foundation, when I first came as a child, was serving about 50, and we've grown significantly over the last 35 years. That's due to a lot of great support from incredible people that have gone through our program. We hire a lot of men and women that have been through Amity Foundation. That's one of our greatest strengths, I would say. The importance of providing in custody or in prison services coupled with community-based services is extremely essential. In LA County, work with Judge Espinosa and Office of Diversion and Reentry, providing in-reach services into the county jails, and then providing access to permanent supportive housing and interim housing with supportive services. We provide employment services, housing, rental assistance, and I will say one of the most important things to really acknowledge is that this is a collaboration. There's no one agency that's going to do this for everybody. Our greatest strength is truly a strong collaboration. With the early releases during the pandemic, we helped place about 13,000 people that were released from state prison through a public-private partnership called Returning Home Well. And a lot of people were able to come home safely because of that. If we put that same effort into efforts all the time to help reduce the incarceration and end mass incarceration, both on the front end and the back end, we'd be in a much better place. And I hope we can truly do that. One of the programs that I'm going to speak to a little bit today is our men's community reentry program and the women's version of it, the Cctrp. It allows people to spend the last 2 years of their sentence in a community-based setting. They're technically still incarcerated. You would not know it if you saw the environment. One of the most important parts of this is really a therapeutic environment, a non-institutional setting. It's so important for men and women to be able to come home and be in a really conducive environment to transformation. So that's really an important step for this as well. We've now expanded it. When it first started, it was 120 days, which was just not enough time. And now I've gotten that up to 2 years, which is really allowing more men and women that are inside of the prison system to spend that time in a community-based setting. I'm a strong believer that both the county jails that have people sentenced to longer periods of incarceration now that you see should be in these community-based settings, as well as those leaving state prison. And we should be able to expand these programs throughout the state. They allow people to receive substance abuse treatment services, healthcare treatment, mental health treatment services, get employment skills and training in the community, and then reunite with family members, and all that while being really in a safe community setting. We have correctional staff that are on site, but at one facility we have 180 people. We have about 50 of our staff and maybe a handful of CDCR staff who really work in partnership with parole, but primarily it's service partners and service providers that are driving the services for people that are coming out in these programs. And I'll just end by saying that we have to really partner that with safe, permanent housing at the end of all of this. If we invest the amount of investment into in-prison services, into community-based services, and people are going to a shelter at the end of their stay in community-based programs, and we failed in our job in providing adequate services in the community. So we're working to build about 500 units of permanent supportive housing, and the state has also been able to give awards with the adult reentry grants to help pay rental assistance. One of the greatest barriers for people coming out of incarceration is the definition of homelessness, which continues to provide challenges and barriers to people that are coming out of prison. LA is unique in the ability to bypass that for local county residents that are cycling in and out of the jails, but most counties do not have that. So these reentry programs, or halfway houses, as you will, really are an alternative to safely bring people home. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thanks, Doug. And last but not least, Mcrp. You're on mute, Matt.
All right. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all the members for having me today. As you said, I was the Secretary of Corrections for just under 5 years here in California, and I can tell you that prisons in California weren't built for rehabilitation. They were built to prevent escapes and to keep inmates and custody members and other staff members safe every day. As a result, there were insufficient facilities built for rehabilitation, and of course, the nature of the facilities themselves, the sights, the sounds, the smells, were not conducive to rehabilitation. And so many inmates, most leave prison without having their identified rehabilitative needs met, which makes reentry so important. In my current position, running a consulting practice, I represent 4 nonprofits who all provide residential rehabilitative services in the community. The majority of formerly incarcerated individuals in California come through one of those 4 nonprofits. The alternatives are really a release from a prison to on a bus to a local community with $200 minus the cost of that bus ticket, or one of these residential reentry facilities like the one that Doug Bond and his staff run at the Amity Foundation. The importance of these, of course, are you either have your contrast of trying to make it on your own, perhaps with some support from a day reporting center or your probation or parole agent, or having the wraparound services that these nonprofits and in some cases for-profit groups can provide. And that includes the wraparound services that were mentioned earlier. That includes providing for really sustainable housing, jobs, rehabilitation services, et cetera. And I think the Stanford report that's been recently released shows really the stark differences in rehabilitation and recidivism rates when people are provided the opportunity to take part in a residential reentry program or a halfway house, especially if it's for an appropriate period of time. So I'm happy to take your questions concerning any of those matters.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Ms. Burton, I wanted to start with you, and I had a question or two. So first of all, I did read the Stanford report that you referred to, and I actually had nothing to do with it, but it was a report commissioned by CDCR and done by a different department at Stanford about the MCRP program. Was it only Amity? But anyway, any event, Ms. Burton, one of the things that came out of that Stanford report, and I was wondering if this is what you were getting at with the Harbor House and your contrast with A New Way of Life or not, was that people who did actually a short period of time in the rehabilitation programs did not fare so well. In fact, I think in some ways it did worse than the control group. But people who spent, I think it was 9 months was kind of the critical time period, did extraordinarily well, and 90% better than control group. And I was wondering if, well, first of all, is your program a CCTRP or is it not? And was that what Harbor House was? Is it required that people stay for a particular period of time in A New Way of Life? Or can you get into that, the difference between kind of a fully voluntary reentry program, which might be especially therapeutic perhaps, versus something that is more of a required reentry program like the CCRP? Is that what was that the contrast that you were getting at before? Anyway, you get where I'm going, driving at.
Yes. So the A New Way of Life is not a CCTRP, and it does not get any resources from California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So Harbor Area Halfway House was a 120-day to 6-month program. After that time, in that, whether it was 120 days or 6 months, the services are terminated and people have to move out, whether they are ready to move out or not. So it's that subscribed time that they have to be there. At A New Way of Life, we know that there are different levels and different levels of resources that people need, and different levels of the ability to move forward. So we'd have no time frame on how long a person can be in our homes. What we do have is our primary reentry homes that people come to once they're released, and in those primary reentry homes, they get their ID, they get their government documents, Social Security cards, they get their benefits if they have any that they're eligible for. All of that is connected. They find their way to school or to employment, and they begin a savings program. They get back connected to their goals and their life's mission. One of my phrases or stance is that people need time to heal from the effects of incarceration, be back connected to their best and highest self, learn trust, responsibility, and be back engaged in their own lives. And they set their goals, they set their timelines, and they're supported to achieve those, because at the end of the day, every one of us we have to live with ourselves. We have to live with our goals. We can't live with goals that are placed on us by corrections or a department or by something outside of ourselves.
Thank you. Professor Ochin?
Thank you all for your comments and for the work that you do, especially Susan. It's good to see you. So I wanted to ask Susan in particular this question, but Mr. Cate, Mr. Bond, I'd invite you to respond as well. Susan, as you know, I've done a little bit of research on policing of women, incarceration, and parole. And I've done some interviews and looked at some of the data that's been collected on this. And one of the things that I heard during those interviews from women who either were on parole or had been released from parole was something along the lines of what you're describing with your contract with Harbor, which was that the system was very punitive. And it felt like an extension of prison in ways that were not supportive of their reentry. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that experience. Is that something that you hear from other folks who are coming home from prison and participating in parole, or if they're not subject to supervision? What their experience is in terms of other kinds of programs that might be less supportive than a new way of life. And then I have some additional questions, but that's the first one.
So what we know is that prisons were designed for primarily men, and women are placed in those structures and under that supervision that was not created with them in mind. And, when it's my belief that people thrive better out of those, away and out of those systems that are involved and staffed by CDCR. When people come to the community should be the ones that are working with those individuals. The types of requirements that are put on by Department of Corrections are harmful. And they're not, I guess, conducive to creating or allowing people to be their best and highest self. They're oppressive and they're constrictive and they're punitive. So I've heard from so many people that they are so thrilled and happy and free to be in an environment like a new way of life.
Thank you. And just to kind of underscore what I was saying, part of what I heard, and I think the studies reinforce this, is the restrictions on travel, difficulties obtaining jobs and keeping them because of compliance checks in their homes, data sharing between different, departments, right? This is what I mean when I say punitive. And so I appreciate you sharing your perspective, Ms. Burton. So I guess I'd ask Mr. Cate and Mr. Bond if you could respond as well in terms of how can the state of California create supportive systems for people as they're coming home to their families and their communities that don't reproduce the kinds of guidelines, rules, and regulations of prison, so that they can become their best and highest selves, as Ms. Burton said, and stay home from prison, get the help, support that they need around trauma, mental illness, substance use disorder, which we know drives a lot of folks to become, in conflict with the law. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that as well.
I'm happy to start. I think, first of all, I would agree with Ms. Burton's comments about prisons being primarily designed for men. as were prison programs initially. While CDCR did undertake some gender-specific programming changes in previous years, I still believe that we over-incarcerate women in California. The data, I think, shows that very few previously incarcerated women commit, especially any crime of violence upon release. And then secondly, I think we should be greatly expanding the numbers who are released early to a halfway house, or in this case, to the custody to community transitional reentry program, or something like the programs that Mr. Bond runs at Amity, or those runs by other providers in the community. The needs are complex and varied. The trauma often that people, not just women, suffered before their incarceration are exacerbated during times of incarceration. And so to unwind all of that, or to the greatest extent possible to provide treatment and care, requires a significant amount of time in an environment that's conducive to change. And so I would both try to get more women out early into these programs and try to expand those programs. And then I'll let Mr. Bond speak about what should be happening within those programs, because that's his area of expertise and more than it is mine.
Thank you. And definitely agree with what both Susan and Matt said as well. And I will say, as somebody that experienced both my mother and my father as incarceration as a child, women are treated very differently in the prison system. And there is a lot more stigma around women being incarcerated than there are with men. And as an adult, of somebody that now actually oversees programs and leads and helps to lead an organization, the culture carriers for our organization are all women. And it's a strong organization that's really led by an amazing group of women. We really have to do more in terms of training in interaction with corrections. I think that requires a lot of training. It should be led by community-based organizations. Strongly believe that we have to do more training in the community for what these services are going to look like and feel like in the community. And we have to create more pathways for people that are formerly incarcerated to be leading this effort and to be working in this field. And so it really is, there are a lot of, like you mentioned, technical issues with travel passes and barriers, I think, for people. We have to create more voices and community advocates to help in that process, though. And I think that's where community providers should really be stepping in to say, this is what it needs to look and feel like, and then be the voice with parole. Having somebody come out that's right out of prison and having them try to voice that is very challenging sometimes. And so we serve as an advocate for that, to be the voice to advocate with parole. We need more advocates in the community to voice that. Yeah. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Professor Ocean, I just have to lend my voice right here to the whole idea of having to have a traveling pass, a piece of paper that you're given to go from one county to the next, that says you have to have on your property, on your person, and the resemblance to that travel pass that holds historical significance of how people had to travel from one county to the next. That's really challenging, and something that parole and this state should look at, and its historical context of having to have this ownership piece of paper with you to travel.
Judge Espinoza.
Yeah, mine is just a nuts and bolts question. for Doug Bond, but it's great to see you, Susan. I always learn something new when you speak. And Doug's good to see you. But Doug, my question is, do you have a sense of what your annual cost of care is for an inmate coming to you from CDCR, and how that compares to what it costs to house that same person in a state prison facility?
So I think there's some information on what we shared, and it is a tough question because it really depends on the facility we get. I would say on average, $125 a day is the average cost per person. I think it's $45,000 per year. And what is not often included in the cost of incarceration is some of the marginal costs as well too. So they split out facilities, staffing, everything. The true cost of incarceration is actually much higher than what we normally see in the numbers.
So that $45,000 cost is your cost.
That's our cost. And then we cover everything with facilities, everything with, it's a full all-in cost. You get into some areas like San Francisco and other parts of the state, it really can be more expensive though.
Yeah. And that's consistent with our cost for the population that we serve. But my question is, do you know how that compares to that same year in a CDCR facility, or can you make that comparison?
Well, Matt can maybe speak to this as well, but I believe it's about half the cost, roughly. And again, to really get that cost, we have to build more of this community capacity and shut down prisons, because as you see, the cost of incarceration doesn't really continue to, until we shut down prisons, you're not going to get that large cost savings.
We're having the same conversation about the LA County Jail right
Yes.
now. Okay.
I have some questions. I have some more nuts and bolts questions. So just to clarify again, on the MCRP program, the MCRP program is an alternative to the incarceration, right? It's the last 2 years of otherwise behind bars in prison somewhere in Tehachapi or whatever you might be. It is at your program at Amity. So it's at a program that's run by a nonprofit organization, but it's paid for through CDCR funding, and they do have some requirements in terms of security and parole supervision. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And how many people, back of the envelope? Oh, and then I'm going to follow up with you, Matt, on what laws need to be changed in order to really expand MCRP. But here's the wind up is, how many people are in MCRP and CCTRP roughly today in California?
1,200 roughly.
1,200. And my understanding is that there are about 30,000 people, is that right, Matt, on a non-COVID year being released from CDCR every year?
Well, that was true a couple of years ago with the numbers going down. I'm actually trying to pull the most recent numbers up now. But that was from a couple of years ago, yes.
Let's call it 20,000 to be generous. Even if it's 20,000, we're still at a tiny fraction of the number of people. And if we're going to do it for 2 years, right, which is what the MCRP program, that's twice that. So that's 40,000 people.
Right.
So that's a lot. So if we thought that instead of the last 2 years of your incarceration, you should be behind bars, you'd be in a community-based residential program, how does one realistically scale that up? It's one thing to say that that's a good idea, but right now we're doing it for 1,000 people and another 19,000 people are not getting it. So the vast majority of people aren't getting these services really. So this is to all three of you. I don't know who wants to go first. How do we scale that up on an operational level?
Yeah,
More funding, and then Matt, also, what are the laws? And Ms. Burton, how do we do it in a way that makes sure as to account for the concerns that you raised? Go ahead, Mr. Bond.
I would just start off operationally. We would have to really look at land use, and in parallel, there's significant NIMBY issues with citing community reentry facilities like this. LA is more open to this, but other counties can be more restrictive, and there's significant challenges there statewide. I would say the other parallel need is developing a workforce.
Right.
Is we got to continue to develop a workforce, and it should be representative of those that we serve. So really doing a lot of work with people that have been impacted and developing that workforce. So those are the two main challenges I would see moving that forward.
If they were funding, how many people do you feel like realistically could California house in one of these programs? I mean, in terms of the workforce that's available, let's put the land use questions aside. I mean, how many, we only have so many providers that are able to do this at scale and at an appropriate level of service. We're currently doing 1,500. Could we go to 3,000 if there were money, 5,000? What's your,
I think
again?
we have to look at it strategically. One thing that's not being done is a comprehensive plan to really scale and look at that from a really comprehensive level of what that would look like. What's the timing for it? Starting these facilities is not just like doing housing. These are very intensive services programs and should be looked at in a more comprehensive manner.
Mr.
I
Kate?
agree.
Oh, go ahead, Ms. Burton.
Yeah, I agree with Doug, but I also believe that there are communities and folks all across the state that want to be a part of providing these types of services within their communities. Thus, we have began, this training program. What I believe that being an effective provider for me doesn't mean that I'm going to serve the most people. What it means is that I'm going to deliver the best services to as many people as I can, and being able to provide and train communities in their, to provide those services in their communities, have ownership in those communities is, one of the goals that we have at A New Way of Life. Thus, we have developed a program called SAFE, and that stands for Sisterhood Alliance for Freedom and Equality. And through the SAFE program, we have ongoing trainings where we're training community members that have interest in reentry and the religious community, and they are replicating our model with technical assistance in their communities.
And how long is the typical stay at A New Way of Life? I know you said that you don't to kick anybody out, but what's the?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I think I left off part of that. So we have our initial reentry homes, but then we have independent homes where people go there and stay for sometimes 2 and 3 years, and they create a community in that home. They create a family environment and setting, and that those homes are practically unstaffed, and they're living there independently, going to work, going to school, and parenting their children in some of those homes. So those are really, really cost effective, because all you have is the home that has to be paid for. No overstaffing. They've already been through the primary reentry home that they've gotten a great set of skills for living in.
And Mr. Kate, I didn't want to leave off in terms of expanding MCRP, aside from developing a strategic plan. I don't know if you wanted to talk about the land use. What are the legal challenges to, if we want to recommend to the legislature to expand MCRP, which already exists, how would one do that? And Cctrp.
Yeah, I'll, if I could just cover a couple of quick things, and then I'll get to your question more directly. You do have a funding issue, and so the legislature will need to fund the expansion. And so even though it's true that the programs that are being provided now at $125 a day, for example, that cost is much less than the full cost of incarcerating someone in prison as a share of the total. It is more than the marginal cost of placing one more person into existing prison, right? And so the Department of Finance will tell you, and the budget committees, that there is a sizable outlay that needs to be made by the legislature and the governor for that purpose. So that's first. Secondly, I think a matter of regulatory law is that the eligibility criteria needs to be changed. Right now, if you look at the Stanford study, it lays out all the criteria. There's 5 or 6 different elements. They include not only your prior history of convictions, but also your current offense. And not only that, but your current risk value to recidivate. it's quite complex. And so in order to, you would need to revisit that with the goal of expanding the program greatly. In other words, CDCR should be empowered, directed to put together a regulatory process that makes a larger number of individuals eligible sooner. And so that can be done either directly, as you know, through the legislature, or it can be directed by the governor to the secretary of CDCR to change the rules and regulations that currently govern that process. There is an issue with capacity in California. I think especially if these people are going to remain, quote, incarcerated, and I'll come back to that designation in a minute, but if these are CDCR inmates who are serving the last period of incarceration in a community setting instead of in a traditional prison, then you do have some barriers to entry. It isn't easy for especially a nonprofit, well, actually for any organization to be able to get and build these houses, because there's so many communities who are opposed to these facilities being in their facilities and in their communities. And so you may need some kind of by right designation, where the local community doesn't have the same level of zoning or conditional use permit requirements that they can impose upon one of these programs. You also have issues regarding the state fire marshal. If you talk to providers, every time they try to renovate an existing facility to prepare it to meet the requirements of CDCR in terms of security, in terms of provision of rehabilitative program, they will tell you that one of the biggest barriers is the requirement that the state fire marshal come through and certify this facility as being eligible for to be occupied. If you instead had the local city fire marshal, who is actually responsible typically in that community for ensuring safe occupancy, if you gave them the authority, you would see, I think, and the other panelists can probably add to this, but you would see a greater number of facilities being built and retrofitted for these purposes. That would require a change of state law, however. The other issue is licensure. I think Mr. Bond and the other providers that I've talked to have expressed some consternation over the strict requirements regarding licensure and experience to be a provider in this area. Again, I believe that's maybe both statutory and regulatory, and experts like others on the panel can tell you exactly how they should go about that. And then there are some, frankly, ideas or concerns we have that may require big change. So, for example, one idea that I've batted around for a while is this concept of allowing people to be released rather than complete their sentence, put them on some kind of a conditional release program, where they're in fact not technically an inmate anymore while they're in these programs. Yes, they're released earlier than they would have been, but they are technically released, and maybe a violation of their conditions of release might result in incarceration, but especially serious ones. But the point is to, right now, if you walk away from one of these facilities, if you're late to want to return from your job, you have technically escaped from prison. And so the fugitive apprehension team is called to track you down. The LA Times receives a phone call so they can report on this escape. It is overkill, and I think it has made growth in the program more difficult politically. So alternatives to having these people actually still be incarcerated should be considered. We're still struggling with underutilization of the current program. I think Mr. Bond was generous when he talked about the 1,100 occupancy. In truth, my clients tell me that their beds are only at 50 to 75% occupied right now. And so the true numbers of human beings that have the opportunity to be in halfway houses in California rests at somewhere between 60 and 70% of the eligible occupancy.
So just to get that number again, how many people are currently in beds?
Like Matt said, it roughly 70% of the 1,200 that are actually in place. So
Oh, I see.
1,200.
1,200 beds, but 60%. So 700 people, very rough math. 1,200
Yeah,
beds.
yeah, I think there's 1,182 slots. And again, the numbers are facility by facility vary, but range between 50% and 75% full. And so roughing it out somewhere between 60, 65%, maybe to be generous, 70% full.
Got it. Professor Ochin?
I'm sorry if I missed this, Mr. Bond and Mr. Kate. Can you talk about your outcomes in terms of the people who are sort of allowed to be in these step down facilities, or people that are in these halfway house facilities? Ms. Burton indicated that among the folks that go through her program, there's a 95% success rate. And I'm wondering if you can describe your success rate, or however you want to characterize it, recidivism, et cetera. What are the rates that you're seeing in comparison to the rates that CDCR has more generally, perhaps folks that aren't released on supervision?
So we're actually digesting a Stanford report. Mike, Mr. Romano mentioned earlier for the MCRP program that just came out yesterday. So we're still going through all the data on that. I believe, if I characterize this correctly, the first year versus the control group of recidivism on that was 93% better than the control group. From the going through all of that, but certainly it has favorable outcomes for it. The other services that you couple with that, and I will say MCRP is one service. Getting people into long-term permanent housing, getting employment. There are so many ancillary services that really have to be coupled with that service as well to really get successful outcomes.
And just
so to put a finer point on.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think you have the Stanford report. It looks like about 35% reduction in rearrest rates after 1 year for those who were involved in 9 months or more in one of these programs, and a 92% decrease in overall reconviction rates for people who are in there 9 months or more.
Correct. Within 1 year. And there's a lot of math in that report. I'm digesting it myself. One of the things that I want to do is make sure that Steve Raphael from the CPL, who's been assisting the committee, also take a look at the numbers. But I mean, 92 or 93% reduction from new conviction is impressive, obviously.
Can I just ask a couple more questions?
Of course.
Ms. Burton, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but can you talk a bit about, so we heard from Mr. Bond about the cost savings of having folks participate in these kinds of, is it MCRJ programs, about $45,000 a year, if I wrote that down correctly, versus roughly twice that for housing someone in the prison population at the state level. Ms. Burton, do you have comparable numbers for your program, either on an annual basis or a daily basis per person? You're muted.
Yeah, on an annual basis, it's about $32,000 a year, about a third of the cost of incarceration. But I think that the big payoff is the difference of what happens after someone has been there for a year. Their lives and their outlook and their whole lives have been transformed, and the productiveness of those individuals are just, you just can't put a dollar on that, versus how someone walks out of a prison gate. I can tell you, Ms. Ocean, Professor Ocean, that every time I walked out of a prison, out the prison gate, I was a little bit more broken, a lot more broken, a lot less hopeful and a bit more desperate. And so I think that there's just, we can talk about a cost savings, but we can talk about the transformation of the possibilities for the lives of those that walk through the doors of some place like Amity, walk through the doors of some place like A New Way of Life, instead of being released desperate from a prison gate and getting off that bus downtown Skid Row, LA, with their only little gate money minus, say they have $1.50 to make a life with no ID, no positive place to go, nowhere. So, I mean, the difference that it can make is just phenomenal, quite a desperate difference.
Not to, yes, sorry, Professor Ochin.
I'm not sure if this is germane to, like, relevant, but I'm just going to ask anyway, because of something that Ms. Burton said that caught my attention, which was the difficulty with CDCR contract as a service provider. And I wonder, does that affect our ability to scale up if the CDCR regulations are too onerous for service providers that are currently existing in the community that want to expand their capacity? So that's one question that I have for Ms. Burton or Mr. Cate or Mr. Bond. And the other is the role of organizations like GEO Group. I know that they have contracts with CDCR, GEO Group being a large private prison corporation, and they also provide reentry services, I believe. And I'm just wondering about the role that they play in helping people transition out of prison. So I'll open that up to any of you to respond.
I'll go and I'll be quick. I just don't feel like there should be a place for these groups to operate within our communities, a private prison group. And I want to also just inform you, I was offered a contract through GEO Group, and after I went through the contract, I just wasn't willing to do. And some of it, I couldn't even do what they asked in the contract. And when I brought it to the attention of the contractor, what he literally told me is, it's okay. You won't have to do that anyway. But I explained, well, I'm signing a contract to deliver on what's in the contract. You just can't tell me I don't have to do what's in the contract to do. It just left me with an eerie feeling about that group and what I'd have to do in order, or how I might come into violation. And, given my experience with violation and rules and what have you, I just couldn't enter into it. So, I believe that there should be resources, outside of corrections that people like Amity, A New Way of Life, and other agencies can access in order to perform successfully for those that we are serving. So that's my to do.
Yeah, I will say it is certainly, it can be administratively burdensome. One thing I will bring to mind is that there is a big push to move everything towards the CalAIM or Medi-Cal model, and that would be something that would actually push out more community-based providers. It is about 80% administrative work and 20% services. In my opinion, that's not a fair balance. And that's not why we do this work. We know we have to do administrative work on this, but I would be very cautious over the next few years as that rolls forward. And then there are various levels of service as well. So there's some like the Mcrp that are pretty intensive in terms of services compliance and oversight for them. And then there are lower levels of housing, where somebody's a lot more independently living, all the way to where we're just frankly paying somebody's rent. And they're, further along in a process. And my personal opinion on Geo Group, there shouldn't be for-profits in this for reentry. It is very challenging, though, if you say, well, if they're not here, then 500 people will go back to prison because they're already in the community and doing those services. So that's a very difficult question, just to be frank with you. But my personal opinion on it is that it is not something that we're seeing more and more for-profit getting into the reentry work, and it should be community-based nonprofits, but we have to build that capacity.
So I would say just add this little administrative detail. I think that currently the women's program is being run by the Division of Adult Institutions, and the men's program is being run by the Division of Rehabilitative Programs. And so what we've seen practically is that it's much easier to work through contract issues with the Division of Rehabilitative Programs because that's their focus, as compared to trying to work through the Division of Adult Institutions on women's programs. They tend to be more by the book. They tend to see these more as prisons as opposed to community reentry facilities. And so I do know that the department is considering pulling everything into one division, the Division of Rehabilitative Programming, to try to address some of those issues. And I think that makes sense to me. I have some experience with both nonprofit and for-profit providers, but not in this field. I don't currently represent any for-profit prison providers, but ultimately the bottom line is, regardless of profitability or nonprofit, for-profit, the department has to manage those contracts. It has to make sure that the program is being run according to the regulations. It's got to make sure that they're inspecting those facilities. It's got to make sure that it's a level playing field. It's got to make sure that everybody is providing the highest quality care possible for the human beings that are taking part in those programs. That's ultimately the department's responsibility.
Thank you very
I will
much.
add that the department's come quite a long ways in terms of being able to work more with community-based providers, and frankly, getting our input and making changes so there can be more user-friendly for community-based groups to do the work.
So unless anybody has any last comments, I do want to try to close at 5:30. It's been a long day. I want to finish just echoing one thing that Ms. Burton said about the finances. Obviously, I think I'm a realist in that, the state definitely has to consider the finances, but and they seem to be positive with these programs as an alternative to incarceration, right? But it's not just the financial savings of not housing somebody in prison. We're also, given the success of these programs, right, the tremendous success of New Way in Life and the Mcrp programs, like saving future incarceration, which is a huge cost, and also saving victims. Like, let's face it, right, with reduced recidivism, which for me is at the sweet spot of this committee, which is improving public safety and reducing incarceration at the same time, and something that I'm really aspire towards. I know that you three spend a lot of your days doing exactly that. And thank you for your time. Thank you all. Thanks committee. Thank you staff in particular. It's been a very long day. We've had a number of people in the audience. Thank you for sticking with us. Tomorrow we'll pick back up at 1 p.m. We'll discuss what we heard today, as well as issues from prior meetings to give priorities to staff for further research. And we'll also do public comment tomorrow. So thank you all. Have a good evening. Committee members, I'll see you tomorrow. The rest of you, I'll see you when I see you. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's been an honor.